Robert Stasko, the President and CEO of Zero Carbon Solutions and Hydrogen Business Council Director, organized the Toronto 8 International Hydrail Conference, where Hydrail and the whole rebooted hydrogen economy was born. Robert's event linked Hydrogenics with Alstom, relaunching the 2008 hydrogen transition. Robert Stasko is a business development professional focused on developing and implementing cleantech energy solutions. This is Energy News Biz Hydrail interview series. To support it, please check out our advertising options in the description. Thank you. And now here is Robert Stasko. Who is Robert Stasko?
I'm basically an electrical engineer who over several years became qualified to become a nuclear engineer. And I worked in nuclear for about 20 years. Basically here in Ontario, there are three major nuclear sites, Pickering, Bruce, and Darlington. I've worked at all of them, some in operations, some in design, some in commissioning. So I have a good background in nuclear. But then I briefly worked in fusion research and spent some time in Europe actually, working at the Max Planck Institute on an international project to develop the first fusion test facility, ITER, which is presently being built just outside of Grenoble, France. In fact, I think it's pretty close to completion. But soon after that, I pivoted to looking at things that would make more impact in the near term. Fusion is a long-term solution, but it's not a near-term solution. Near-term solutions are something that can bend the curve on emissions of CO2 in this decade. And so that is one of the reasons that I started looking very seriously at renewables, energy storage, and in the end, hydrogen as a carrier of electrons, in effect, that could be manufactured and then reused later, either in transportation or back into the electricity grid.
Could you provide some insight on your roles in Hydrogen Business Council and Zero Carbon Solutions?
Thank you. So yes, the Hydrogen Business Council is a group of what I would call enthusiasts here in Ontario. 6 years ago, we came together to fill a vacuum because we found that when the governments were looking at policy or programs to incentivize carbon reduction technologies, they preferred to talk to industry associations. They did not like talking to individual companies. Now, mind you, that's changed a bit recently when it comes to batteries. But we created the association, the Hydrogen Business Council, to represent the sector, the hydrogen sector here in Ontario, specifically, to some extent in Canada, but mostly here in Ontario. Because we understood the electricity grid here in Ontario, we understood the uniqueness of the fact that 60% of our power here in Ontario is from nuclear power. And that is somewhat specific to Ontario. We recently affiliated with a national organization called the Canadian Hydrogen and Fuel Cell Association. They deal more with things at the federal level. And they also have affiliates in BC, one developing in Alberta, another in the Atlantic provinces, hopefully one in Quebec as well. So we are now becoming an organization that has affiliates across Canada, each with its own unique situation in the energy space. As far as Zero Carbon Solutions is concerned, that's my own consulting company. So I do consulting from time to time, but most of my efforts these days relates to hydrogen and advocating for hydrogen solutions. Now, I should just mention why Hydrail. Hydrail has the best business case right now for virtually any other hydrogen solution. And I can talk more about that later.
So let's go back in time a bit. How did you start attending Hydrail conferences and how was it like?
There's a very good friend of mine by the name of Stan Thompson, and he lives in Charlotte, North Carolina. And Stan found me somehow, I don't know how, through social media, and invited me to a conference on Hydrail. This was back, I think, around year 2000. And so I became aware of Hydrail. He was actually one of the first proponents of Hydrail that I know of in North America. And since then, I've stayed in touch with Stan. He's been just an excellent friend. But honestly, he's fighting an uphill battle because he's been trying to get hydrogen and rail in his locale, in and around Charlotte and in North Carolina. Whereas I've been kind of focused on Ontario, and I always thought we had a better shot here, but that's maybe a story for another day. So as a result of my involvement with Stan, I actually ran a Hydrail conference in Toronto here in 2013. And that was a very successful conference. And I like to think that it was a seminal conference in that this is where Hydrogenics, that makes traction systems for trains, met Alstom. They met for the first time here in Toronto in 2013. And it took many fits and starts in over 10 years. But in the end, the Cordia Island, which is now running successfully in Europe, was a result of that meeting because it uses traction systems from Hydrogenics, which is now part of the Cummins family of companies.
Who are the most important people in Hydrail, in your opinion?
Oh, it's a tough question because obviously Alstom is the first company to actually have a commercial product. I know there are others out there, but they are the ones that seem to have come to the market the fastest with a product that is clearly commercial ready and being put into active service in Europe and in Germany for the first, as far as I know. I know that there are also hydrogen trains that will be running in France. There's hydrogen trains running in the UK, which I think are actually refitted electric trains that are being refitted to run on hydrogen and fuel cells. I know that there's one in Denmark, but I haven't followed it much, and I have to apologize in advance. When it comes to global companies, when it comes to what's going on in other jurisdictions, I'm not that aware. And the reason is we're still a small association. We don't have a lot of bandwidth. That could change, but right now we have to focus on Ontario and on Canada.
We'll stick to Canada then. Hydrail in Canada, what's the current status and plans?
Right now, as you probably know, Alstom took the step of actually bringing a hydrogen train to Canada, and they will be running it on commercial service between Quebec City and a beautiful, I guess you could say, natural destination somewhere on the Gaspé Peninsula. Pardon, I can't recall the name of the town, but as I understand it, every summer they run these trains commercially for tourism, for people who are interested in natural beauty. They get to see the mountains, they get to see the Gaspé. It's a beautiful, from what I'm told, and I'm actually hoping to ride that train. And so Alstom and Quebec have decided to use this as a stepping stone, if you will, for Alstom's product here in North America. I'm hoping that we can run a pilot with the same train if the gauges are compatible here in Ontario, but it's early days. In terms of the rest of Canada, other than this one, what I would call a pilot project, a very ambitious pilot project to actually bring a train here to North America. But right now, it's getting a lot of interest. So I can see a replication of it in BC, maybe in Alberta, and certainly here in Ontario.
What do you believe are the key benefits of Hydrail over diesel powertrains? And do you think that Hydrail will replace diesel, or will these two coexist?
I think it's a very good question. I think they will coexist for some time to come. And a lot of, as you probably know, a lot of the locomotives and a lot of the systems that are running on diesel right now in light rail and in freight, in moving freight as well, these tend to be diesel electric. In other words, you have a diesel engine that's running generators, and they use the generators to power the traction system on the wheel that gives you high torque. Well, it's not that difficult to take that platform and put a fuel cell in instead of diesel engines. So some of these platforms can be remodeled rather easily to become hydrogen powered. But to your point, will it replace diesel? Well, it depends on the motivation. If you want to reduce greenhouse gases by electrifying your rail corridor, then that's clearly the way to do it. But many will say, well, it's not economic in the near term because we don't know what the cost of hydrogen will be. Diesel is relatively cheap. So I don't see that transition happening quickly. However, what is happening quickly is that many rail corridors are converting to electric, not so much for CO2 emission reduction, but for performance improvement. Because if you have an all-electric train, you can accelerate much faster out of a stop position. You can pull more cars, apparently. I'm not a rail specialist, but this is what I'm told. So here in Ontario, for instance, the organization called Go Transit that's running most of our commuter trains wants to convert to electric. And they were looking to do it, and I think they still, to some extent, may be committed to do it. I hope not too committed. The old-fashioned way, with overhead infrastructure, wires, with concrete structures that hold up those wires, with transformers, with protection systems. This will require raising some bridges, expropriating some property. It's an infrastructure project. So this is why Hydrail, I think, has a great business case, because when you look to Hydrail as a way of electrifying your corridor, assuming that the hydrogen comes from electricity, then you only have to change out the rolling stock, and you only have to have one fueling station at one end of your corridor. It's simple. It's not an infrastructure project along the lines of overhead electric infrastructure. And we've had instance after instance where that infrastructure project of putting up overhead catenaries can take up to 10 years. And it runs into all kinds of roadblocks that no one anticipated. That's what's happening here in Toronto with our crosstown light rail. And so our case is always, this is a cheaper and it's a faster transition to electric.
What are some of the major challenges that Hydrail technology currently faces, and how do you see these being overcome?
It's awareness. Awareness is the biggest. Whenever I look at barriers to adoption of hydrogen solutions, it's always about awareness, not just among the general public. In fact, in the general public, they have other issues on their mind. They tend not to think about hydrogen. And in fact, their first reaction is typically puzzlement, because they understand batteries when we're talking electrification. They don't understand that hydrogen is yet one other form of electric drive, if assuming, again, you use electricity to produce the hydrogen. What we want is to raise awareness with the decision makers, with people in the professional class, with elected officials, with people around elected officials who help them make decisions on procurements and on policy and on programs. So that awareness is the toughest part. And that's one of the reasons why the Alstom train in Quebec this summer will help us, because there'll be a lot of publicity around that once it starts to operate, I'm pretty sure. And that kind of buzz always raises awareness. People ask the right questions. They get some answers, maybe from people like me. So that's one barrier. It's the major barrier. The second barrier is they're always looking for a locked-in price of hydrogen and a locked-in source of hydrogen. That's a little bit tougher. I know here in Ontario, for instance, there are many organizations that are beginning to be interested in being a source of hydrogen. Electrolytic hydrogen produced at one of the locales that would be close to the rail corridor. But price is tough. Anywhere, if I walk down to a gas station or a diesel station, can I tell you from one day to the next what the price will be? No. It's hard to get a long contract, and it will be more expensive in the near term. And I'm not just going to throw a few numbers around, but hydrogen at the very beginning of a project like this might cost between $5 to $10 per kilogram. We want to get it down to about $2, where it starts to compete with diesel. But look at all the other savings that you might avoid, and look at the carbon emissions that you avoid, and there'll be a carbon, basically a carbon offset that you can, that will be monetized. You can monetize that. So there will be a business case ultimately, but the first few projects might be a little tough because of hydrogen, its cost, and its sourcing. But the final barrier, and this is an important one, is there are a lot of companies out there that like the status quo. When you go to an engineering company and say, I want to electrify my rail corridor, and then they give you the plan, and it's very expensive because it's an infrastructure project. You say, well, why are you not using hydrogen, or why are you not using some other tech? They'll say, well, we've done it this way for 100 years and it works. And I said, that business model can be hacked. Tell that to the taxi company. Tell that to the phone company. Oh, we've been using the same business model for 100 years. This is the time to start looking at your business model and saying, is this the way we want to move forward? Using the technologies of 100 years by electrifying in the old-fashioned way. But there's a lot of money to be made when you get a contract to put in a conventional electrified system. And many of the proponents of those systems still have the ear of policymakers and decision makers. That's a barrier too. Now, the good thing about Alstom, and I don't want this to be a commercial around Alstom, but I'm just, as I said, they're the first out of the gate with a commercial product. They can do it either way. And typical of large companies, they'll tell the potential customer, we can do it the old way, we can do it the new way. You tell us what you want.
How do you think widespread adoption of Hydrail technology will impact the transportation industry as a whole?
I think once you see successful application in one specific area, it replicates to others. And in fact, many people who, when they first hear about hydrogen at the public general population level, they'll say, oh, I hear that there's hydrogen cars running around out there. Well, yes, there are, but there aren't many fueling stations. At the light end of the transportation spectrum, batteries are still probably the best bet. If you're in an urban setting and you leave your car in a garage overnight, batteries will always be better for you. But cars, although it means you can refuel faster and you can go farther if you use a hydrogen-powered electric platform on a car, the business case is not as compelling unless more and more fueling stations become built up and become part of the common infrastructure. And our feeling is that heavy transportation, trains, trucks, and buses will be the first adopters of hydrogen electric technology. And when those move forward, they end up producing nodes or hubs where hydrogen might be retailed to other end users such as cars.
Are there any exciting developments and advancements in Hydrail technology that you are particularly excited about?
Right now, the one that excites me, and I have to be honest, it's a long shot, is here in Toronto, Canada, we have, as many big cities do, have a rail connection between our downtown, our rail station, and our airport. So you can get the UPS Express. You can get on and go from your airport to downtown Toronto. You can then get on their rapid transit system. So it's a great way to get into the city. Or if you're in the downtown core and you want to get to the airport, it's a great way to do it. That is presently diesel powered. And the GO Transit that operates that system has been thinking about electrifying that corridor for many years. The last time they did a study to find out how much it would cost was almost 10 years ago, and it was $500 million to electrify that corridor, and it's only 18 kilometers. So needless to say, that has not happened. Although many of the communities along that corridor would like to, they would be happy if diesel emitting, locomotives stopped going by their house. It's not enough of a reason. But I know that they're thinking about electrifying it, and they're just waiting for the right technology to come along. And our feeling is this is it.
What role do you see government policies and incentives playing in future of Hydrail?
I think it comes back to what we were talking about earlier, the price of hydrogen. The price of hydrogen will be a decision maker. And even though you can take some worst case estimates of what your hydrogen fueling costs will be going forward for 10 years or so, and then bring it back to net present value, compare it to your savings, it's still not a bad deal. But many decision makers will look at that and say, no, there's too much uncertainty there. So what government policy can do is backstop the cost of hydrogen. They can do it in several different ways. They can incentivize the production of electrolytic hydrogen by giving a special electricity rate to a company that's making hydrogen. And this is what the Ontario government is contemplating right now. And it's not an easy proposition. If we go back 5 years, here in Ontario, we had a surplus of generating capacity. And we very often sold electricity to our neighboring states in the US, Pennsylvania, New York, and Ohio, at less than cost, because nuclear plants can't adapt to loads the way other technologies can. They can't ramp up or ramp down. The economics are such that they have to run continuously. Well, because we're electrifying so many other elements of our industrial base and other transportation with electric cars, our additional or surplus capacity is running out. Regardless of that, the government is still thinking of having a special price for electricity for hydrogen. And I think that's an important step if we can do that. They can also incentivize the capital cost of putting in the infrastructure, which the federal government is doing through an income tax credit. So those are two mechanisms right off the bat: electricity price, tax credit. If you're going to up to 40% is what the federal government will give, although typically you're more likely to get 15 or 30%. And then of course there's mandates. The government could come along and say, by 2030 we'd like, I'm just going to pick a number out of the air, our transportation sector has to reduce its carbon emission by this amount. And you can do it any way you want, but you have to do it. Now, here in Ontario, we have not done that yet, although the federal government does have mechanisms to put that in place through carbon tax. That's about it right now. I can't think of anything offhand, but I guess to summarize it, the government's role is to incentivize things that reduce carbon emissions. And they've been doing it on many, many fronts. This is one more arena where they have to do it.
Are there any potential risks associated with use of Hydrail technology, and anything that we should be aware of?
There are financial risks always when you're putting in any kind of new technology. And this is one of the reasons why it's good to observe what's happening in other jurisdictions who may have been early adopters, which is what's happening in Germany. So we're watching them with great interest. I'm not sure if you were talking about safety risks, but so far the safety record for hydrogen technology is excellent. And when people ask me, is hydrogen safe? I will very often ask them this question: do you have a barbecue? And they'll say, yes, I do. I said, is it safe? And they'll think about it for a while. And I guess it is. I said, well, think of this as yet another compressed gas, like propane, only there's no carbon. And frankly, it's as safe, if not safer. Is there always a chance that there could be an accident? Well, yes, that's why we have codes and standards that have been developed over 100 years for hydrogen, as it's how it's stored, how it's used. So it is safe. And another one of my favorite, I guess you could say, anecdotes is that in the UK, they've developed a prototype fire engine that's a fuel cell operated fire engine. And I said, if a fireman, if it wasn't safe, do you think a fireman would be driving it to a fire?
Makes sense. In your opinion, what role will hydrogen play in transition to a low carbon economy? How important do you think it will be in achieving global climate goals?
I think it's very important, but I will state categorically, it is not a single solution. And so being an engineer, I know that, for instance, the traction system for a train or a traction system for a Class 8 truck, which is another one that has a good business case for hydrogen, will always have some batteries. You want a battery, you want an ultracap, you want a fuel cell, because you want the high torque at the beginning that the battery will give you, but the fuel cell runs continuously. You don't want to put a demand on it as you would when you're stopping and starting and regenerating electricity, through braking, regenerative braking. All of that is an engineering issue. And yet, in the mind of the public, I see something called battery bias. They say they understand batteries. They know that you can plug in your car just the way you plug in your phone. So this is all very simple. So, but I want to say that batteries are not the total solution. As I've said right from the beginning, they are part of the solution in decarbonizing. Hydrogen is yet another electrolytic way of getting electricity to offset fossil fuel. And so, depending on your application, either one works. Now, I will have to mention that there is so-called, this is green hydrogen I'm talking, or clean hydrogen, because we're talking about nuclear generated electricity as well. I know that in other jurisdictions like Alberta here in Canada, they're looking at blue hydrogen, where they take methane and use traditional methods to make hydrogen and then sequester the CO2 in underground storage. That works too. But in our jurisdiction here in Ontario, we don't have oil and gas. We import that. So we're looking more to generate the hydrogen electrolytically to the extent that we can. In the end, it will depend on the market.
What do you see as the most effective strategies for reducing costs and making hydrogen more competitive with other forms of energy, but from a commercial perspective?
Just as I guess, as everybody knows, the more demand there is, the more production there is, the prices per unit come down. So I think the economies of scale will in effect work in our favor, as they do in many other technology developments in the past. So I'm looking to the fact that early adopters will be driven by policy, by carbon reduction measures, but that later participants will be looking at better prices as a result of those early adopters. And this tends to be the kind of thing you see over and over and again in the technology arena, where there are a few early adopters that might have a special reason why they're moving quickly that's specific to them or locale. But then by creating demand, the prices come down for the products. And I think that's what's going to happen with hydrogen. To give an example, right now, all of the hydrogen-powered long-haul trucks that you see being developed here in North America are very small production runs. They might be making 10 or 20 trucks maximum, because the buyers are only buying 2 or 3 of them. And that's not commercial. That's not going to make you a commercial product. If you're making hundreds or thousands every year, then suddenly the price will come down. And that's what we're hoping to happen.
What are some of opportunities and challenges you see in the hydrogen industry right now?
I think I get asked this question a lot by investor class people. What should we invest in? It's a tough gig. And let me give you an example. The war in Ukraine was a black swan that changed the whole dynamic of energy production and use globally. Suddenly Europe wanted energy, so they were not dependent on Russian natural gas. So the Russian-Canadian alliance came to be, where they're going to be building facilities in Atlantic provinces to produce electricity that will then make hydrogen as its sole product for shipping to Europe. I did not foresee that 3 years ago. Many other people did not foresee it. It is one of those things that just came out, that the wind resource in Atlantic Canada is so immense, and so they will never need it all for the electricity that they will require in the Atlantic provinces. They have a huge surplus of wind resource that it will be unused. And so now they have a use for it. And so that kind of thing was unforeseen. And there are many such things that will be unforeseen by us that will come forward and suddenly become opportunities. So in terms of investor class projects, Atlantic Canada is looking pretty good. BC, same with BC. In Alberta, investor classes are looking at, again, end uses of hydrogen technology, because there will be producing very large quantities of blue hydrogen in Alberta. and the pricing will probably be very attractive to uptakers in transportation and for industry. Here in Ontario, I think most of the opportunities I see will be on the industrial side. We know that there are many companies here in Ontario that want to start producing green ammonia and green fertilizer from that ammonia, green methanol as feedstock to other industries, green steel. Fasco in Hamilton is converting its whole steelmaking operation to total electric and hydrogen. They will need electricity and hydrogen to make clean steel. And we estimate that by 2030, they will need about 800 tons of hydrogen per day to basically continue manufacturing steel at the rate that they're doing now. So around those industries, there's going to be opportunities. It won't just be transportation.
Over the next decade, how do you see the role of hydrogen evolving in global energy mix?
I've looked at, there are many think tanks that have been making that kind of prognostination. I don't pretend to be an expert in this, but I've seen what looks like the demand curve for hydrogen going forward. And I think a lot of it is very speculative, as I said, because there's a lot of things can happen between now and 2050. But basically, they're saying that by 2050, 40% of our energy will be coming from hydrogen. And the majority of that hydrogen will be clean. It will be from clean sources. And frankly, I think that's essential. I think that's exactly what's going to have to happen if we're going to decarbonize our society.
Are there any incentive programs specifically related to hydrogen in Canada?
The one I mentioned earlier is the one that's probably got all of the investor class people interested, and that was the income tax credit from the federal government. So if you are buying capital equipment to make hydrogen, if you're buying if you're spending money on a capital expenditure, including rolling stock, you can get an income tax credit from the federal government. And then, of course, there's a clean fuels mandate. You have to follow. In the end, we're going to be looking at a clean fuels mandate from the federal government. So it's carrot and stick. So at the federal level, there's definitely programs in place to incentivize hydrogen. And in other provinces, it varies. In BC, I know that they've got incentive programs because they've got several fueling stations. Whereas here in Ontario, we only have one right now. But there'll be more. I know that there's more on the horizon here in Ontario. So basically, it's one of the things about Canada is when it comes to energy, we're highly regionalized. And so you'll see each province has a slightly different take on how they want to adopt or incentivize hydrogen.
How do you see hydrogen fitting into broader policy landscape? And what impact do you think policy decisions will have on the growth and adoption of hydrogen as energy source, especially in this environment you mentioned with different regions and so on?
I think, again, it comes back to what I was saying earlier, in that the government has to make a commitment that it wants to decarbonize. And the extent to which they make that commitment, they will be putting policy and programs in place to make transition easier in the near term. And it's very important to make government decision makers aware that any intrusion that they're putting into the marketplace early, they can pull out of it once things become pre-commercial or commercial. We don't expect that we need government subsidies or government mandates forever, only for maybe 5 or 10 years until the industry reaches a critical mass and becomes self-sustaining. And that will vary from province to province. There are provinces where there's capital money quite ready to be used by investor class people. Others where not so much. And to give you an example, in the Atlantic provinces, my understanding is most of the investment money is coming from offshore. It's not necessarily Canadian companies that are investing in the opportunity there to create hydrogen for export. And so, but local governments are taking steps to make sure that that kind of open economic opportunity is there for investor class people.
Hydrogen from nuclear. There's a debate on this, and what's your opinion on it?
It's a multifaceted issue, and I don't want to get too technical, but when we talk about electricity from nuclear here right now, today, it would be electricity from a nuclear plant. And there is potential for a lot of that because there are times there, even now with a constraint on our grid, there are times in the evening when there is a surplus of electricity. And unfortunately, it's not, that surplus doesn't last long enough to pay back your investment in a capital, hydrogen making electrolysis unit. So there's still going to be some debate about how best to incentivize that hydrogen pricing issue. But I still see a big role for nuclear produced hydrogen in the near term. But over the longer term, there are nuclear technologies that can produce hydrogen directly from very high temperature gases that you have in advanced reactors, advanced modular reactors. And I know that many jurisdictions are looking at those reactor technologies to produce hydrogen. But honestly, it all comes back to this decade. My feeling is that by the time you have a prototype operating that does that and that replicate it enough to have an impact on climate change, we're talking 2050. I want to see the curve bent in this decade. What technologies do we have in our basket now? Because if we don't bend the curve this decade, we will never bend the curve. That's my opinion. But to your point, there is some controversy. I know that there are many environmentalists who feel that nuclear is not the way to go. There are many environmentalists who have accepted the fact that nuclear has a role to play in zero emission future, and that debate will continue. But one thing is not debatable. Here in Ontario, 60% of our power is from nuclear. I'm always shocked at how few people know that. And so that fact, and we are in the process of constantly refurbishing our nuclear reactors so they can keep operating. I'm a big fan of CANDU. It's one of the best reactor technologies on planet Earth because you can use uranium from without having to enrich it. No other technology can do that, to use unenriched uranium. And so that tells you a little bit about the whole issue around nuclear risks.
Hydrogen in geopolitical sense. What's your opinion on it?
Well, geopolitically, it looks like Canada has the potential to be a net exporter of energy, as we have done in the past with oil and gas. And so I had not envisioned that, but it's beginning to look that way. And as I said, what's happening in the Atlantic provinces, to some extent can happen in British Columbia, to some extent can happen in Alberta if they can find a way of getting their product to market. So I see Canada as being a net exporter of hydrogen as an energy source to jurisdictions that have no local sources of fossil fuels, no local sources of nuclear, or none of the other technologies. They will look at hydrogen as a future non-carbon fuel. So geopolitically, it puts Canada in a good position. And in the near term, definitely helping Europe get through an energy shortfall with hydrogen.
Robert, thank you for being my guest today.
Thank you very much, Ines. This has been really, really insightful, just listening to your questions.
Thank you, and hopefully see you soon here again.
Okay. Thank you.